Dr. Rufus Black is the Master of Ormond College and a Principal Fellow of the Department of Philosophy at the University of Melbourne. An ethicist, theologian and management consultant, he writes and works on ethical, public policy and education issues. Before becoming Master of Ormond, Rufus worked at McKinsey & Co for 9 years, where he was a partner. Rufus.
Thank you. The short story that I want to tell about a large problem today is the following. I want to make the point quickly that the world is on an unsustainable trajectory, and then to talk about what it's going to take as leaders in order to put us on a very different kind of trajectory. That the world is on an unsustainable trajectory, I think, can be established quickly. If we just take the two near unalterable facts of population growth and economic growth, combined with our current ways of organising the world, you see the foundations of the unsustainable trajectory. And we celebrated the kind of crossing of the sort of 7 billion mark very recently. We are heading for a population somewhere in the tune of 9 billion. We are going from a world of $75-odd trillion economy to a $450 trillion economy by mid-century. We know what that's doing to our world now in terms of the environment, whether we are looking at the carbon challenges or our water challenges. By 2030 on water, we are going to need the equivalent, just on today's trajectory, of the equivalent of almost the entire volume that we're using in world agriculture today. Soil we're using non-sustainably, habitat and species loss is well known. Our society is not in entirely good order if you look around the world at the level of conflict that we have. And of course, if we look to the foundational things of happiness, you can draw that graph for almost any developed country in the world where wealth goes this way and well-being stays flat. And we are well aware of the rising mental ill health challenges. These are all problems that we face across the world, and they have a lot to do with the nature of the way we have the world organised. I'm going to suggest that they have 4 features to them, these kind of problems. They are all of the challenges in dealing with our unsustainable world. The problems are complex problems. They involve systems, both natural and human systems, and often the interplay of the two of them. They are wicked problems. In other words, they are problems that keep changing as we work on them. They are not problems that are amenable to being put in a test tube and figure out what a range of solutions are and then acting on them. Very different to that. And they are almost all global in nature. So they involve very high levels of interdependency across the world. And it's clear in any of those sets of challenges. Even a challenge like water, which can feel very local, till we recognise how much water we import and export in the foods and manufactured products that we use. They are also cognitive problems. They are to do with the way we think about the world. And what I want to argue about these set of problems is that we are not well tuned to dealing with them. Our humanity is not ideally suited to dealing with problems that possess this set of qualities. And to pick on just 2, the complex problems. One, I think, of the great advances of our recent times has been both our ability to understand complex problems and to understand how people deal with them. What we recognise, and behavioural economists have done a great deal to help us see it, is that our behavioural biases run against our ability to deal with complex problems. And I've listed a kind of set of our classic cognitive biases up here to the difficulties when it comes to dealing with complex problems. And if you take something as simple as the last point about discounting, where we know we discount the significance of the future, and the trouble with complex problems is that the future is actually what we're constantly needing to prepare for. We are very self-orienting. Often that means that we neglect second-order effects and we drive problems up and down. We don't lead them quickly back to equilibrium. It is our biases that get in the way. But our 21st century challenges are also very much cognitive challenges. They are to do with deeply seated attitudes and behaviours. And if we just think about a few of our challenges, our carbon challenge, which has a lot to do with our high energy attitudes and behaviours. The very temperature of this room right now is an example of a whole bunch of high energy attitudes and expectations that are unsustainable, at least if we don't change either the technology or our behaviours, and it'll no doubt require both. Water, again, a classic kind of problem to do with how we actually choose to live and the kind of diets we export and make popular around the world. But I think more importantly, there are deeper seated behaviours and attitudes we need to tackle, to do with the challenges of how we think about basic ideas, particularly in the West, around freedom. We have a view that really we should be able to have anything, anytime, any place, a life without constraint. It's what I like to call the strawberries in winter attitude. Now that, on the kind of planet we now live in, is a remarkably unsustainable view of the world. But we also don't confront those limits. We hide our limitedness away. We hide our mortality away. We hide the boundaries of what it is to be human, and we have turned that into a major social exercise to do that. And we still, despite the staggering wealth that we have on the planet and in societies like ours, we still measure our wealth rather than our happiness, where it's our happiness that's the challenge much more than it is our wealth. Now, if we are to make a difference against that set of challenges, we are going to require some, I think, quite distinctive capabilities, because our ability to deal with these problems doesn't come naturally, and they're not easy challenges to tackle. So this is, I think, a sketch that many have talked about what the kinds of capabilities are that we are going to need to deal with problems that possess these qualities. Qualities that leaders are going to need to have if they're to deal with them. If we are dealing with systems that are complex and wicked, we are going to need the ability to think in terms of systems and to invent new systems. That means inter-systems thinking. We are going to need judgment, not just the ability to analyse. We need to be able to recognise, to engage in that extraordinary talent of the human mind, to engage in pattern recognition. We will need adaptive leadership skills, which is not where the leader commands the answer, but communities engage in finding the solutions in the communities, because large-scale mass change requires that kind of exploratory shifts that go on in communities when they quest for the answers. And of course, if we're to do any of that, we will need the full range of our intelligences, our social and emotional intelligences, well tuned. Our global problems will require global ethics. At the moment, we find we struggle for global consensus because in many ways we struggle to reach agreement about what the right thing to do is. And that in part is because our ethics, I think, are in a fairly poor state. There are also cognitive challenges that we have to meet. And that, I think, is going to require some reorientation about where we find our sources of meaning and value. We need practices to nurture different ways of thinking about what's important to us. And whatever happens, there's a lot of change on the way, and we're going to need some serious resilience. So we're going to need some very new capabilities. These are capabilities that I think all sorts of different authors have mapped and described. And that is where my optimism really arises. Because what I think we're going to need is all of some new thinking to support those new capabilities. And if we want to kind of group that up, and it's not just one idea here or there, because I'm struck by the fact that we often get an idea here and an idea there, and what we actually need is a different way of looking at the world. And I think we're going to need some different accounts about the world, about what it is to be a human person, about how we should live, both what's the right and wrong thing to do, and what practices we need to nurture, and we need some thoughts about how we produce change. It is what I want to call a new humanism. And I think that is an attempt to encapsulate thinking that is well and truly out there in the world of thought that has been bubbling along for some time, and I think we need to be grouping up if we are actually to build the capabilities we need. And so here is to describe some of the shifts that I think we have around our world and the systems thinking that if we take the first challenges around our world, which is a different way of thinking. We have tended to think in causal chains, in linearities rather than in relationships. We have tended to think by breaking things into parts as the start of the problem solving rather than to think about how things relate to one another. Relationality is actually, not at least in some parts of the world, is how people think. In the West, particularly, the basis of Western philosophy is dividing things up into their separateness and describing their properties. We need an integrative, relationship-based way of thinking. I think we need a very different account of the human person. The accounts that have predominated today see us as either rational economic actors, self-interested replicators of our genes, or we celebrate will and choice as our primary quality. We need a vastly better, rich, multi-dimensional understanding of what a human person is and what fulfills their lives and what their purposes are, if we're to be able to get those shifts to happen. We also need some different approaches to ethics. The utilitarian approach that has dominated the world, much because of its twinning with economics of the greatest good for the greatest number, I think has caused us enormous degrees of difficulty, partly because everything can become a means to an end, and that means everything can become instrumental. And in a world where we need to see the inherent value of things, that's a big problem. We need an ethics that is about living in community with others. It's about who we become being just as important as what we do. We also have some challenges about how do we nurture a better set of practices about how we live sustainably in the world. And that's a spiritual task. We have a rejection of the synthesis of science and religion in most places and a predominance of fundamentalist accounts of religion, and I think also fundamentalist accounts of science in some cases. We need to recognize that, in fact, those barriers need to be broken down and that we can have, if you like, non-theistic forms of religion for those who aren't up for the notion of a God. Buddhist accounts. Buddhism is a non-theistic form of religion. There are many ways in which we can have a deep spirituality whether or not we buy a larger metaphysics. And I think we're going to need that if we're to nurture the practices that actually cultivate the kind of leaders that people need to be. And we need a very different model of change. Our model of change is very deficit-oriented. It tends to be built on what's failing rather than what's working. So in each of these areas, the great strength of where we are today is that I think there are a range of thinkers in relation to each of those accounts who have progressed our knowledge a great deal. And at a conference like this, that list of thinkers, I think, should be well known to many. These are the people who've been turning up at leading-edge forums and in leading-edge places, offering their thoughts for some considerable time. What strikes me about them is that when we put all of them together as a list, when you start to think about the people who've led thinking about systems thinking, ways of rethinking our world, the people who've been rethinking how our accounts of the human person should work, whether they are philosophers, economists, or educators like Nussbaum, Sen, and Gardner, all of a sudden we see that we really have a well-developed account that we can draw on. It certainly contrasts with more reductive accounts that are out there, but we have a strong integrative account. Michael Sandel, who I think is the kind of current global rock star of the ethical world, has offered us a much better Aristotelian account about how we live well and how we focus our ethics on purpose. And then there are a number of people who have put forward very compelling accounts of a non-theistic spirituality. And the movements to produce change that align, I think, so well with these around positivity, with people like Martin Seligman and David Cooper-Ryder. Again, becoming well understood. Our task now is to make sure that our leadership puts all of those components together in a different account of what it is to be human in our world today. And if we were to sum that up for what it might mean for leaders, I think it means that we need a leadership that is T-shaped. That is about breadth, that is about ensuring that we have an integrative, multiple intelligences focused view of how we deal with the world, but that also recognises we are going to need staggering discipline depth. The previous presentation I thought was a masterful example of why, for all of the breadth we need, we are still going to need, across many fields, a technical depth that is deeply impressive in order to tackle the kind of challenges we've got. And as my good friend Michael Rennie, who I know is speaking later, taught me some time ago, the great enemy of this kind of leadership thinking is an either-or, that it is one or the other. We need to embrace deeply the thought that it is about the and, how we do both of these things, how we celebrate our breadth while retaining our depth, that we are serious about our creative breadth of capacities as well as deeply focused on our analytic ability to probe very profoundly and deeply. And always, because I think it's important to say that innovation in creating these kind of minds and these kind of leaderships begins in surprising places. The place where it is beginning here in Melbourne is a little community school of 60 children just down the tram line that runs outside this building down in Fitzroy, the Fitzroy Community School, where they focus extraordinarily on classes from prep, solving problems as a whole class, whole school discussions of values, a school where people prepare food in the school, where they don't actually live. I mean, the life of the school spills out into the community, which is actually the focus of where learning happens, where meditation is taught, though often not by that name, from primary school on, and yet at the same time an absolute commitment to disciplinary depth. With the strictest kind of application of the best methods that evidence has provided us with for how we need to understand maths and build our language capacities. It is not an either or, it's a very profound and. So if we are to tackle these challenges that are complex, that are wicked, that are global, and that are cognitive, then I think the task for all leaders is to form a T-shaped mind. Thank you.
Rufus, thank you. That's